Good morning, everyone. It's good to be back with you again this weekend. Last weekend, Kylie, Alora, and myself had a little family camping getaway, and we went and explored some of southwest Victoria, some places that I've never been to before because I'm pretty new to Victoria still. And so we had a really great time going down there. And part of the thinking of going on this camping trip was earlier on the year, leading up to Big Camp, that was the first time that we'd ever gone camping as a family of three. And we bought a new tent and some new camping equipment. And a couple of months ago, I was thinking about this, and I realized with a baby on the way next year, it's probably going to be a little while before we go camping again. And so we thought, let's make the most of it and have go away for a weekend. And now something I've discovered about camping with a toddler is you have to take a lot more stuff. And when I go camping by myself, usually you can fit it all into your backpack and it's all light and it's streamlined. But when you go camping with toddler, it's so much stuff that you take. And when we went to Big Camp, we basically filled 2 whole cars going to Big Camp. So this time I thought, we don't want to go in 2 cars. Let's try and squeeze it all into one. And you should have seen how full our car was. I don't think there was room for one extra book or one extra towel. Every single little crack or hole, we'd shove something in. And I remember putting it all in and then doing that. You've probably done this before, where you have the boot and you've got things kind of precariously balancing in the back of the boot, and you're trying to close the boot because you know it'll fit, but you don't know how to keep it there while the boot door is closing. And so you get your hand out of the way and you close the boot, and I remember hearing that click and thinking, yes, we've done it. It's all in. And so remember, we all hopped in the car, and then I pulled out my phone and got Google Maps up, put in the address to where we're going. And that's when I suddenly realized that we had a decision we needed to make. Would we go the way that Google Maps was recommending, which was the direct route to our camping site, or would we go on a bit of a scenic journey there? Now, the scenic journey that looked nice on the map, it was certainly windier, it would take longer, and probably be more likely to cause a bit of car sickness along the way. Or we could go the way that Google Maps algorithms recommended, which was the quicker way, the straighter way, the direct way, the better roads. Now, of course, we chose to do the scenic trip. And now, that was just so happened to be the Great Ocean Road, which also I'd never done before, so there was a lot of reason to go down there and do that. But we were so glad we did, because the reason for us having a holiday was not just to get to our camping destination, but we were there for the journey. We were there for the experience, and we were there to get as much as we can out of the whole adventure. Now, the reason I share this with you is because I think in life sometimes we can easily get very destination focused. And there's so many things that we can be working towards in life, whether it's that university course that we want to get into, and then that job we want to get, and then that house we want to buy, and then that person we might want to marry, and then that whatever it might be. There's all these things that we're often moving towards, and sometimes we can find ourselves racing through life trying to get to that next thing. And I think there's value sometimes in appreciating the journey along the way. Slowing down, feeling less rushed, and this is exactly what Lisa was talking about in her welcome this morning, and appreciating all the things that God has for us, not just at the journey, but along the way. Now, we are going through the story of Moses, and this is definitely true for Moses and for the Israelites. We're up to in the story, they've just left Egypt through those incredible miracles of God, and God has given them a destination. They're on their way to the promised land, the land of milk and honey, and they kind of feel like they're going to just go straight there. But little do they know that God has an incredible scenic route for them to go on that's actually going to last 40 years. And God is going to lead them not on the quickest way, but He's going to lead them on the best way. Because God knows that there are certain lessons that they need to learn along the journey that they're going to learn best while they're in the wilderness, while they're on the journey, better than they can even learn when they get to the destination. And so let's dive into the story. And I want to invite you to get your Bibles out, because most of the verses are going to be in the Bibles, not on the screen today. And so if you've got the green Bibles there, there's also going to be page numbers on the screen as well. So we're going to start in Exodus chapter 13 and verse 17. So I'll give you a moment to find that. Exodus chapter 13 and verse 17. All right, so it says, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt ready for battle. So the first thing we learn about the way that God was leading them was that God intentionally, he purposefully did not on the direct path. And it says that there was a direct path, but God said, no, we're going to not go that way. We're going to go down through the desert towards the Red Sea. Now, the reason that God gives for not going on the direct path was there was a nation of people along that path known as the Philistines. Now, the Philistines were a powerful nation. They were experienced in warfare, and the Israelites were experienced in making bricks. They'd been slaves for a long time, and they probably knew a lot of things, but they hadn't faced those kinds of situations. And so God, in his mercy, decided not to lead them directly into an experience of war because he realized that they might get discouraged in that situation and afraid and want to go back to Egypt, which is something they actually do a number of times. And so the Philistines are there, but God leads them on this other direction. And one of the things that this shows us, the lesson we get here right from the beginning, is that sometimes God, in his mercy, will lead us along the slow path. Sometimes God, in his mercy, will lead us along the slow path. He'll lead us on detours in our life. He'll lead us on indirect routes. And I think the reason that God does that is because often there's things that we can learn along the way. And for the Israelites, of course, God could have worked a miracle like he would do so many more times, and he could cause them to have some amazing thing happen and they defeat the Philistines, and he could have led them through that scenario. But if they were going to go that way, they would have had to have trusted God through that. And for many of them, they hadn't really learnt the lesson of trusting in God to that extent and yet. And so God is going to lead them along this slow path because he needs them to first learn the lesson of trusting in him. Now, how did God lead them through the wilderness? Well, let's read another couple of verses. I'm going to read chapter 13 still, verse 21 and 22. It says, by day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. Now, I think this is really cool. So here they are wandering through the wilderness, and God is literally visible to them the whole way through. He's going before them in this huge column of fire by night and this column of cloud by day, and all they need to do is keep their eyes fixed upon that of God's presence there in that column, and he will lead them all the way home. Now, if you think about the practicalities of moving through the wilderness in such a big group, there would have been lots of reasons for them to get stuck. Hundreds of thousands of people with all of their animals, they would have spread over an incredible amount of land. And it would have been very hard to lead these people, firstly to keep them together and to leave them in the same direction. But what an awesome way that God came up with to lead them in such a way that as long as they all just kept following that big pillar of cloud, that big pillar of fire, he would continue to lead them together in that same direction. And I think this is actually a really beautiful picture of following Jesus. Now, when we talk about following Jesus, we usually think about the New Testament, where Jesus would walk around and find people and say, follow me and I will make you fishers of men, or things like that. But I think this here is actually an Old Testament picture of a group of people who are following Jesus. Now, in an earlier sermon when Fraser was talking about the burning bush, we learnt that God, when he revealed himself to Moses in the burning bush, he said, I am who I am. And Fraser shared with us that later on in the story of Jesus, there's actually several times where he actually claims that name for himself. And it's kind of like Jesus is saying, hey, you know those stories of the Old Testament where God was leading his people? That was me. That was me leading them all the way through. And so this picture I have of them in the wilderness here is there's all these people, and Jesus is right there, visibly in this pillar of fire, this pillar of cloud, and as long as they keep their eyes fixed upon Jesus, he promises to lead them all the way through to the promised land. But one thing that's interesting about the way that God is leading here is that even though God's leading is so visible and is so clear, God never reveals to them the whole journey. He only ever reveals to them the next step. Yes, he tells them we're going to Canaan, we're going to this land of milk and honey, but they have no idea about all the highs and lows that are going to happen over the next 40 years on the way to that promised land. They have no idea how there's going to be manna falling from heaven. They have no idea how God's going to provide for them and the challenges that are going to happen and all of these things. God doesn't reveal any of that. He simply reveals the next step. And I think that often in our lives, that's a little bit how God leads us in our life. He doesn't reveal to us all the things that he has that are in store for us in the future, but he reveals to us enough to know where to take the next step. Now, an illustration that I've often liked that illustrates this as well is the idea of headlights. Now, I want you to imagine that you're going on a road trip. Maybe you're starting in Melbourne, and you're going to go down that windy Great Ocean Road and make your way around to Adelaide or somewhere like that, and you're doing it at night. One of the cool things about headlights is those headlights can actually light your entire path all the way from where you are right now, across hundreds of kilometers all the way to your destination. But the thing about headlights is they never light up the whole journey at once. All they ever light up is that next 50 or 100 meters. But here's the thing, when you're driving, you only need to know the next 50 or 100 meters. And as long as you follow that, you drive along that road that the light shines up, when you drive that 50 meters or the 100 meters, what happens? Suddenly, you see the next 50 meters, you see the next 100 meters. And then you drive that, and then what happens? You suddenly see the next 50 meters, the next 100 meters. And so all the way, you don't know where the destination is taking you, but you can see God's leading all the way through. And I think that's what was happening here in the wilderness. So here they are, they see Jesus, he's there in the pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire, and they just have to, day by day, follow wherever God leads, and he will take them through the entire journey. Now, this reminds me of something that Jesus is going to say later in the New Testament, in the book of Matthew, and I want to read that for you now. So Jesus in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 25 says, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes?" So here Jesus talks about all these things that we worry about, and often these are future things. Often these are things that we're worried about, and we don't know how we're going to navigate through the path of life. And this is what Jesus' solution is. He says, instead of being someone who's always worried about what the journey might have ahead of you, he says, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. And so I think what Jesus is saying here is if we put Jesus as first in our life, we seek first him and his kingdom, we will have all the guidance and direction that we need. But it might not be the whole journey. But God will give us enough light to live out what needs to happen in the day ahead. And as we focus on what's happening today and we walk in that light that Jesus gives us, then he shows us the next day. And then he shows us the next day. And day by day, he can lead us through our life experience. So let's see where God is going to lead them through the wilderness. So Exodus chapter 14, verse 1 to 4. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi Hahiroth between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea directly opposite Baal Zephon. Pharaoh will think, the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. And so the Israelites did this. So here we see that instead of leading the Israelites in this direct path, God leads them in a confusing path, a squiggly path, a path that really is confusing and doesn't make a lot of sense, at least from the surface. And God says that as you go on this path towards the Red Sea, the Israelites are going to be watching. Now, it makes sense that they were watching because the Egyptians were very organized, they were very powerful, they had well-organized armies. And so it makes sense that across the borderlands of Egypt, that they would have had systems in place for monitoring if there are dangers approaching from afar on the borders of their land. And so God says, as you're wandering in this squiggly path through the wilderness, the Egyptians are going to be watching, and they're going to think that you are getting very confused. Well, let's see what happens, how the Egyptians respond. So verse 5. When the king of Egypt was told that Pharaoh had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they encamped by the sea near Pi Hahiroth, near Baal Zephon. So the Israelites are looking on, and the report comes in. I keep saying the Israelites and Egyptians, keep getting this confused, but the Egyptians are looking on, and the report comes back. The Israelites are confused. They're walking around in circles. They're trapped in this area near the Red Sea, and suddenly Pharaoh and the officials have this change of heart. What have we done? Why do we let them go? And I imagine they look at Egypt, which is in ruins in many ways, and they think, how are we going to rebuild? Now we don't have any slaves to help us rebuild. We need to go recapture them. And so Pharaoh leads the charge here, and he musters the entire Egyptian army to go and chase down these Israelites. And so they go down, and the Bible seems that it didn't take them that long to catch them, and eventually they have them cornered. There's the Red Sea on one side, there's the Egyptian army on the other side, and the Israelites look out in horror, and they realize that they are totally encircled, totally trapped, and they're literally between a rock and a hard place. Have you ever found yourself feeling like that? Trapped. Nowhere to go. The options that you think are available, they're bad and they're worse. Maybe some of you are feeling that way today. That there's things in your life that you would love to change the situation, but it feels like there's no way forwards. Now, it might not be every aspect of your life, but maybe there's some aspect of your life where you feel trapped. It might be your finances. It might be your relationships. It might be the job, the career that you're in. It might be just the situation that life has led you in, and you find yourself thinking, how am I ever going to get through this? And it feels like there's no way forward. Well, I think one of the reasons maybe that the Red Sea story, we have this in the Bible, is to encourage us when we feel like that. To encourage us where we feel like there's no way forward. So let's look at how Moses and the Israelites respond. Verse 10 to 14. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there was no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone'? Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." And here's Moses' response. Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance of the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." So let's start with the people that are standing before Pharaoh here, and they're looking up and they're seeing the Red Sea on one side and they're seeing the armies on the other side. How do they respond? If you were to describe their response in one word, what would it be? Maybe call out a word. Fear, panic, regret, despair. That's the word I thought of. The feeling that there's no way forwards, this panicky, fearful situation, and there feels like there's no hope for them in this situation. And so they cry out to Moses, "What have you done? Why did you bring us here? We told you to leave us alone and you persisted, and now we're here. We're going to die in the desert. It would have been better to stay as slaves." And they're just in this terrible place of despair. How does his response compare? If I was to describe Moses' response in one word, it would be faith. Moses, when everyone else is choosing despair, Moses looks at the same situation and he chooses a path of faith. And I think the statement that Moses gives here is one of the great faith statements in all of Scripture. And it's so good, I want to read it to you again. And I've got it up on the screen here. Moses says, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Stand firm. Be still. You don't have to fight. You don't have to run. You don't have to hide. You don't have to cry. Just trust. Be still. Now, what's interesting in this situation is Moses is able to say this even though Moses did not himself see the way forward at this point. And I think sometimes it's easier to have faith when we can in our minds sort of work out what a forwards path might look like. But it's much harder to have faith when there seems to be no path forwards. And the thing I love about Moses' response here is that Moses trusted that God would find a way even though they couldn't see one. Even though it seemed like there was no way forward, Moses still said, "Be still, stand firm, God will find a way." And it reminds us here that even though sometimes in our lives we might not see a way forward, it doesn't mean that God can't see a way forward. Just because it feels like every option is bad from our perspective, doesn't mean that God doesn't have a higher perspective that he can see from. I want to share with you an awesome quote from the book Desire of Ages that really, I think, speaks into this, and it says, "Our Heavenly Father has 1,000 ways to provide for us of which we know nothing. Those who accept the one principle of making the service and honor of God supreme will find perplexities vanish and a plain path before their feet." 1,000 ways to provide for us of which we know nothing. Just picture the Israelites there. Here they look in one direction and there's the Red Sea, the other direction there's the armies of Egypt. It looks like there is no path forwards. But what this is suggesting is that from God's perspective, there were 1,000 paths forward. They just couldn't see them yet. And so Moses chooses to trust, and I think that what this is for us in those situations is an invitation to trust in a God who sees much more than we see, who sees pathways that we didn't yet even know existed. So let's finish reading through the passage and read the story of how God comes through and opens up a pathway where it seemed like there was no pathway. So verse 19, it says, "Then the angel of God who had been traveling in front of Israel's armies withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. So here, I love this cloud moves, and it's like God just moves in between the two and puts his arms out like a big wall, and a big wall of protection around his people. Almost like a mother hen who's putting her wings out over her chicks, protecting the Israelites there all night long. We're up to verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on the left. So here is this pathway that you never would have imagined this was going to happen, that God would forge a dry pathway through the Red Sea. But this is one of those 1,000 ways that God could have rescued them. Verse 23. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving, and the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Remember what Moses said? Be still, stand firm. The Lord will fight for you today. And what is happening? The Egyptians now are saying, they're panicking, saying, God's fighting for them. Verse 26, then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea at daybreak, and the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing towards it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea, not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. So here we see the waters come together, the Egyptian is consumed by the sea, and here the Israelites just stand on the other side. Now they're free. Now their past is no longer chasing after them. This is really the moment where they cease to be slaves, I think. And here is where they really, at least for this day, they learn the lesson of trusting in God. So the final question I have for us here is, how do we do this? How do we actually do this in our lives today? How do we live this life of faith? How do we choose faith rather than despair when we find ourselves in these moments of feeling trapped, these moments of panic, these moments of fear? Well, I want to suggest to us that we can look in three directions. We can look back, look up, and look forwards. Firstly, look back. For the Israelites, when they faced this Red Sea crisis, what would they have seen if they looked back? They would have looked back and they would have seen themselves as slaves in Egypt. They would have remembered the story of how God did those incredible miracles where the plagues came and did these amazing things and delivered them from Pharaoh. And maybe that would have reminded them that if God could deliver them from that situation, then maybe God could deliver them from this situation as well. And I think in our lives as well, that's why we have the stories of the Bible. Because as we look back to those stories, they're supposed to fill us with faith for today. And it's not, I like to suggest as well, it's not just the stories of the Bible that we should look back on, but our own personal stories. What are the ways that God has worked in your past? What are those ways that God has shown up when you've found yourselves in difficult situations and you've trusted in him and he has pulled through for you? I really want to encourage you to reflect on those stories. Maybe write a list of them, journal them, have some way of collecting and remembering not just the Bible stories, but your own family's faith stories, and think of them often, because I think those are there to inspire us in faith as we move into the future. There's a quote written by Ellen White where she says this: "We have nothing to fear for the future except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and is teaching in our past history." And I think that's the mistake that the Israelites did on this day. They had all these incredible things that God had done for them, but it was like they suddenly had spiritual amnesia, and they suddenly forgot what God had done, and so they had fear for in the situation they were in. So firstly, we need to look back. Secondly, look up. Now for the Israelites, if they looked up in this moment of crisis, what would they have seen? They would have seen this big billowing pillar of cloud, this billowing pillar of fire. Now, how might that have inspired them with confidence? And I think they were fixed on the disaster, they were fixed on the Red Sea, and their eyes were fixed on the Egyptian army and all the terrible things that were going to happen. But if they had lifted up their eyes and they had looked and remembered that God was with them, that Jesus was with them, and He was leading with them, if He was with them, then they had nothing to fear. And so for us today, I want to encourage you to keep looking up. Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. Spend that time each day in prayer and connecting with Jesus through studying the Word. And bring Jesus into your life and remember that He is with you, because that's something that will fill us with confidence as we face these situations. And the final thing is to look forward. And for the Israelites, if they look forward, what would they have seen? They would have remembered the promise that God had given them, that He was leading them to the promised land, that land with milk and honey. They didn't know the journey, but God had given them the destination. If God had promised it, they weren't going to perish there on that day in the wilderness, but God was going to lead them all the way home. And for us, if we look forward, what do we see? We see a similar promise to a promised land. God has promised that He is leading us to a heavenly promised land, an eternal kingdom where there is all of the awful things that chase us down in this life will be no more, where there'll be no more sin or death or mourning or pain or all of those horrible things, where it will be a perfect, beautiful world that we'll get to live in for all eternity. And God has promised that to us. And so I want to encourage you to remember the things that God has led you in the past, to keep your eyes fixed on Jesus today and keep your eyes fixed upon that promise in the future. And as long as we keep putting Jesus first in our life, as long as we keep our eyes fixed on Him, and we keep walking the step that God reveals to us for today, God will lead us all the way through this life, and He will bring us through to that heavenly home, that heavenly promised land. And so I'd like to invite our musicians to come up the front, and we're going to sing a song. And as we sing this song, I want to invite you to let this song be your song of faith. As I read through the lyrics of this song yesterday, I thought, wow, there's so many lyrics here that connect with this story. And so I want to encourage you to let this be your song of faith, your way of saying to God, whatever might be happening in my life right now, I'm putting my faith in you, Jesus. I'm fixing my eyes upon you.